So when we're talking about supply and demand, and we're talking about price floors and price ceilings, part of what we want to know both as informed citizens, but also part of what we want to know maybe if we are working for the government or working for the county or the city or something like that, right? We want to know who is this going to impact and how is it going to impact them, right? And with supply and demand, we have two groups, right? We have consumers and we have producers. And so we are going to assess this. We're going to assess, how price floors or price ceilings impact consumers and how price floors and price ceilings impact producers. And so in order to do this, I'm just going to go ahead and extend this a little bit. I'm going to extend this a little bit as well. You'll see why in a second. Go ahead and extend that guy. Okay. So when we're talking about consumer and producer welfare, or it's not really welfare, it's more their surplus. So a surplus is this weird economic term that is essentially saying any extra utility or satisfaction gained on top of, above and beyond what you paid for it. So we have to kind of go back into our definitions. What is a demand curve? A demand curve is a schedule telling me the amounts that different people will pay. So, if I break it down, there's somebody who's willing to pay a lot of money for this good, right? There's somebody way up here who's willing to pay, and again, let's just throw some numbers out there, right? They're willing to pay $100, but let's say the good is only $10. The market price is $10, right? Well, for that particular person, this whole rectangle here, right? This whole 90 units, 100 minus 10 times 1, is their consumer surplus. They really, really, really wanted that good. They were willing to pay $100 for it. They only had to pay 10. And so the extra $90 is this amorphous, ephemeral thing, the extra utility or satisfaction that's gathered, and we call it consumer surplus. Similar thing for the next person, right? There's somebody who's willing, who's valuing it at $90. And so they're going to have $80 worth of surplus. There's somebody, at $70 and so on and so forth, right? So at the end of the day, this whole rectangle here is my consumer surplus. Questions on consumer surplus? So again, it comes back down to what's the definition of demand? Demand is the willingness to pay that people have, but they're not actually paying that. They're paying the equilibrium, the P star, the $10. But there are people that value this good or service much more than that $10. So that's what we're trying to capture here in the consumer surplus section. Similarly, in the producer surplus section, everything above supply but below the price, right? So similarly in the supply side, there's a producer who is willing to provide, they're not willing to provide a lot of the good, but they're willing to provide some of the good for maybe, let's just say for the sake of our example, $1. But they're not going to have to sell it for $1, right? They're willing to part with that good for $1, but they are going to actually be getting $10 for it. So the producer surplus for this would be 9 for the first one. If the second one is $2, then it's going to be 8 for the second person, right? Or 8 for the second unit that's provided. There's a lot of different ways that we can kind of slice this. But again, at the end of the day, which is Professor Dr. McCarthy's favorite thing to say, at the end of the day, this whole shaded area above the supply curve but below the equilibrium price is what's known as our producer surplus. So this is the extra value or utility or satisfaction gained by producers from selling the good at the market price and not at their lowest minimum selling reservation price, whatever you want to call it. Questions on producer and consumer surplus? So this is a way to just kind of visually, but also mathematically, right? This is a triangle. We know the area of a triangle is 1/2 base times height. We can calculate the area of these two things to figure out how well are consumers and producers doing in different markets. Make sense to everybody? All right, cool. So now the question becomes, how do price floors and price ceilings impact consumer surplus? So let's first do a price ceiling example over here, and then we'll do a price floor example to the right. Price, quantity, demand, supply. Equilibrium price, equilibrium quantity. So the first thing we're going to do, we're going to do the price ceiling first. And a price ceiling, we know, has to make the graph look like a house. So price ceiling is going to be below the equilibrium price. And what we find with a price ceiling is that our producer surplus starts out as this thing over here, and ends up being, so when we have a price ceiling, let's think about this. If this is the quantity supplied and this is the quantity demanded, what's actually happening in the market? Which one of these points matters?
Well, the suppliers are only going to supply what they can reasonably make a profit off.
Very good, Su Yang. Yes, so this point is the one that matters. Right? This one doesn't really matter so much. This one only matters if we are trying to calculate what the actual shortage is in terms of the number of units or something like that. But for the most part, that point doesn't matter as much. This point matters because that's the actual quantity that's going to be supplied. Very good. So our consumer surplus is going to be all of the parts of the, so it's going to be the big rectangles from the demand curve all the way down to this price ceiling. Up until that point where that last unit is being sold. Not up until the point where the last unit is being demanded. That doesn't actually matter. People can demand stuff all they want. It's not a market transaction. The only market transactions that happen because the suppliers are willing to actually supply the stuff. So you understand how our producer surplus goes from this big rectangle here to this weird parallelogram here. Nope. Cool. Awesome. Relatively easy for us to figure out what happens to the producer surplus. The producer surplus went from this big rectangle over here to now this series of, or triangle, rectangle, series of rectangles, but this triangle over here, right? So this is our producer surplus. So we can tell, just by looking at this, that the producer surplus shrinks anytime we set a price ceiling. Now, the way that I drew this, and the magnitude of the price ceiling, meaning the distance between the price ceiling and the equilibrium price, and the way that I drew the relative slopes of these supply and demand curves, which has to do with their elasticities, which we'll get to in chapter 6, or chapter 5. The way that I drew these seems quite clear the consumer surplus increased, right? That is a trick, though. In order to actually figure out if consumer surplus increased or not, you would need to calculate the area of the triangle and then calculate the area of this parallelogram and then figure out which one is larger. Sometimes you can do it just visually, but a lot of times the extra amount that consumers are gaining by the price decrease from the price ceiling is eroded by the decrease in the quantity supplied, right? The quantity supplied when the price ceiling, so our new equilibrium quantity, essentially, it's not an equilibrium quantity, but our new quantity that's actually being produced is down here. And so there's a bunch of sales that would have happened in this range that would have provided some consumer surplus that we're no longer going to have. So the existing people that still buy the good are still able to buy the good because there's a shortage, right? So the existing people that are able to buy the good are getting more consumer surplus individually, but the market writ large is perhaps not getting more consumer surplus. We have to calculate it ourselves. Yes, Su Yan.
But producer surplus is always decreasing.
Always decreasing. Very good. Yep. Producer surplus is always decreasing when we implement a binding price ceiling. Yes. Good question. All right. Let's do price floors. Let's see if I can do it a little faster, because it's pretty much the same exact thing, but just with floors. It helps when you're drawing these if you start from the y-axis, just because of just to make the rectangles nice and easy. All right, so if we have a price floor, we know a price floor has to be above the equilibrium so that we can put some stick figures and a disco ball and everything like that, right? A price floor is going to be above the equilibrium. And so we're going to go from having a producer surplus that was this large rectangle to having a producer surplus that is this smaller rectangle. Or sorry, consumer surplus for both of those things. We went from having a consumer surplus that was this big rectangle here to a smaller consumer surplus because of the price floor that's being implemented. So in this particular instance, consumers are worse off because of the price floor. Now this becomes a bit more convoluted, because oftentimes what are we talking about when we're talking about price floors? We're talking about minimum wage laws. Who are the demanders of laborers?
Employers.
The employers, the businesses, right? So so in this case, price floors are negatively impacting the employers because they are the people that are actually demanding the labor. And again, we're going to get into that more in chapter 4, which is going to, once we finish this, we're going to jump right into chapter 4 and start talking about labor markets and stuff like that. All right. So again, when we have a situation like this, there's two different points that the price floor could have us, paying attention to. Are we going to pay attention to where the price floor matches the supply, or are we going to pay attention to the price floor matching the demand? So some of you might say, well, last time we paid attention to where the supply was, right? But again, but not again, but this is a different situation, right? It doesn't matter that suppliers are willing to supply this amount if people are only actually willing to spend and buy this amount of goods. So regardless of the situation, it's always the quantity, it's always where the price floor intersects a curve first. So it's the first one. So the first one in our price ceiling was the quantity supplied. The first one in our price floor is the quantity demanded. Does that make sense, everyone? Because again, it doesn't matter if they're supplying all the goods in the world. If Walmart has a whole bunch of TVs on the floor, that doesn't actually mean there's been economic activity, right? They have to sell those TVs. So when we're talking about producer surplus, we are going to go from the supply curve all the way up to whatever that price floor is. And so producer surplus is going to look like the weird parallelogram this time. And so producer surplus went from this big triangle to this weird parallelogram. And for the same reasons as why we can't ascertain whether consumer surplus increases or decreases without actually calculating the area and stuff like that, same exact reasons a lot of times we might be able to just eyeball it, but for the most part, because of the fact that any increase in the producer surplus from the higher price is going to be eroded by less sales, we just don't know which effect is going to be stronger. Is the price effect going to be stronger? Is the quantity effect going to be stronger? That's going to determine whether or not the producer surplus actually increases or decreases. Now, some of you who've done the reading are probably wondering, well, there's a third thing that happens here, right? There's this pizza slice that used to be half consumer surplus, half producer surplus. What's going on with that now? Well, these pizza slices are what's called dead weight loss. So these are the negative impacts of the government meddling with competitive forces, right? If they were to just let competition prevail, then the equilibrium price would be what it is, and these regions, these regions would be either producer or consumer surplus. But because of the policy that's been implemented, the places that used to provide surplus now provide nothing. So that's why it's called a dead weight loss. Questions on price floors, price ceilings, impacting consumer producer surplus? I'm not going to make you calculate any of this stuff. I think that's just busy work, but I want you to understand it.
Just to double check, that dead weight loss is lost social surplus, yes?
Yes, very good. Lost social surplus of belonging to both consumers and producers. Yep.